So we're going to talk about rational functions. And rational functions is just, you know, we've been looking at linear equations, we've been looking at quadratic equations and different polynomials. This one's called a rational function. And basically, in a little bit, you'll see how it looks. Let me get my pen. So one of the first things we want to do is to look at how a rational function is set up. And basically, it's a polynomial divided by another polynomial. And the domain is going to be all real numbers except for those that cause the denominator to be 0. So previously, we talked about finding the domain. And one of the questions we asked was, if it has a fraction, what are the numbers that would cause it to be 0? So if you remember from class, we said that we would take the denominator and we would set it equal to 0. And if I solve for x, then this number here cannot be in the domain. Okay, so my domain for this function is going to be everything except for 5. So we can write it as negative infinity to 5 union 5 to infinity. And so for these 3 examples, they are kind of a review of what we have done. Let me just move that down. So if we look at example 2, find a domain, something we can do here first is factor the polynomial down here. So this is going to factor as, what do we get? So this is going to be 6 times 2 is 12. And I need the 4 to be negative, so this would be a positive here. So if I set each of these equal to 0, then I'm going to have that x cannot be 6 and x cannot be negative 2. So these guys can be in the domain. Okay, so for the domain, we would write it as from negative infinity to negative 2. And so if you can imagine the number line that we did in class before, we have going from negative 2 to negative 2. I'm sorry, negative infinity to negative 2 union negative 2 to positive 6 union 6 to infinity. If any questions?
No.
Okay. So let's try example number 3. So here we have in the denominator, x squared plus 25. If I set it equal to 0, I get x squared equals negative 25. And here, since it has a negative, if we take the square root, then this becomes 5i, plus or minus 5i. So this is an imaginary number. And so when you get an imaginary number, there's really no number that you can put in here that's going to cause us to get a 0 on the bottom. Because if I use negative 5, it would become a positive 25 plus 25 would be 50. So we're okay there. So there's really no number that can be excluded from the domain. So the domain would still be negative infinity to positive infinity.